It was just another old photograph of Propocatus, until researchers finally understood the message hidden in plain sight. The image resurfaced in the fall of 2019 from the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. It had been donated decades earlier, as part of a large collection of World War II memorabilia. Labeled simply Military Group Portrait, Camp Lee, Virginia, 1943, it had been stored in a climate-controlled room alongside thousands of similar photographs, waiting in quiet obscurity. Dr. Jerome Patterson, a military historian who specialized in the history of segregated armed forces, discovered the photo while researching for a book on African-American soldiers during World War II. He had seen hundreds of such images before: formal portraits, training drills, deployment ceremonies, but this one made him pause. The photograph showed 15 soldiers arranged in 2 neat rows against a backdrop of Virginia pine trees. 14 white soldiers stood in perfect military formation, backs straight, chins lifted, arms rigid at their sides, uniforms pressed and identical. Their expressions were serious, typical of wartime portraits, young faces marked with the weight of an approaching war. But it was the 15th soldier who drew Dr. Patterson's eye. At the far right edge of the formation stood a black soldier, positioned just slightly apart from the rest present, yet isolated, while the other soldiers held the standard posture. His hands were not at his sides. Instead, they were deliberately positioned in front of his body. At first glance, the gesture was subtle, but once noticed, it was unmistakably intentional. His fingers and palms formed a precise configuration, not random, not accidental. Patterson leaned closer, his pulse quickening. In decades of studying segregated military units, he had never seen anything like this. The soldier's face remained neutral and disciplined, revealing nothing, but his hands told a different story. Patterson immediately requested a high-resolution scan of the image and spent the next 3 hours examining every detail. The photograph was unusually sharp for 1943, clear enough to distinguish individual faces, read unit insignia, and study the exact positioning of the soldier's hands. On the back of the photo, written in faded pencil, were only a few words: 3000 and 7th Quartermaster Company, Camp Lee, VA, April 1943. Dr. Patterson photographed the image and sent it to 3 trusted colleagues: a specialist in African-American cultural history, an expert in World War II military organization, and a scholar known for her work on resistance within oppressive systems. His message was brief: look at the soldier on the far right. Look at his hands. What do you see? The replies came within hours. All 3 noticed the same anomaly. The gesture was deliberate, too precise to be accidental. The soldier was clearly communicating something, but what? And why would he risk doing so in an official military photograph during a time when even the smallest deviation could lead to severe punishment? Dr. Patterson obtained permission to remove the photograph for further study. That night, alone in his office at the University of Virginia, he placed the image under a bright desk lamp, stared at it for hours at that frozen gesture, held quietly across 76 years, waiting to be understood. The soldier looked to be about 22 or 23. Strong features, steady eyes that seemed to look beyond the camera to some distant point in time. His face offered no answers, but his hands spoke volumes if only someone knew how to listen. Dr. Patterson's investigation began with a single question that would soon consume the next 18 months of his life. What message was this soldier trying to send across the decades, and who was he? He started with the gesture itself. He enlarged the image until the hands filled his screen, studying every finger, every angle, every fraction of space between them. It was not random. It was not a movement caught mid-frame. It was a sign held long enough for the camera to capture it clearly. He ruled out standard military hand signals. It wasn't American Sign Language. It wasn't semaphore or any known wartime signaling system. Yet something about it felt familiar. He turned to anthropological studies, cultural records, and historical documentation of African-American community practices. 3 days into his search, during a faculty meeting, a colleague from the African-American Studies Department, Professor Diane Harper, mentioned one of her graduate students' theses on cultural gestures and identity markers within black communities in the early 20th century. After the meeting, Dr. Patterson showed her the photograph. Professor Harper studied it silently for a long moment. Then her eyes widened slightly. "May I show this to someone?" she asked softly. "I think I know what this is, but I want to confirm it." She introduced him to Marcus Williams, a 72-year-old community historian and activist who had spent his life preserving African-American cultural traditions and resistance practices. Marcus had grown up in Richmond's historically black neighborhoods and had learned directly from elders who had lived through the Jim Crow era. The moment Marcus saw the photograph, his reaction was immediate. He gently touched the image, tracing the outline of the soldier's hands with his finger. "He's making the sign," Marcus said quietly, emotion thick in his voice. "The equality sign." Dr. Patterson leaned forward. "The equality sign." Marcus nodded slowly. "It's not widely known outside our community, especially not today. But back then, during segregation, during the worst of Jim Crow, we created our own ways to communicate. Ways to speak when speaking out loud could get you beaten or worse." Marcus explained that the gesture hands arranged in a precise configuration, symbolizing balance, sameness, and equal measure was a silent declaration of humanity and dignity. It was a way of saying I am your equal, or we deserve equality, without speaking. Words that, in the wrong place and time, could get you beaten or killed. "Sometimes we used it in photographs," Marcus continued, "especially official ones, images meant to document us as inferior or separate. It was our way of leaving proof, of telling whoever might one day see the picture I was here. I was human. I deserved better than this." A chill ran through Dr. Patterson. "How do you know this?" "My grandfather taught me," Marcus said. "He served in World War II, Quartermaster Company, Labor Battalion, segregated. He didn't talk much about the war when he came home, but he taught my brother and me certain things. How to stand tall when the world tries to bend you. How to speak truth when speaking could get you hurt. This sign was one of them." Marcus looked directly at Dr. Patterson. "This soldier in your photograph, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was leaving a message. He was testifying." With the meaning of the gesture finally confirmed, Dr. Patterson faced a new challenge, identifying the man who had made it. The photograph offered only fragments, unit designation, location, and date. But Dr. Patterson had built his career navigating incomplete military records. He knew where to begin. He submitted requests to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, for all available records related to the 347th Quartermaster Company stationed at Camp Lee in April 1943. Quartermaster units handled supplies, equipment, and logistics essential work that was rarely celebrated or well documented. Units composed of black soldiers were recorded even more poorly, their contributions often reduced to statistics rather than names. 3 weeks later, the response arrived, 2 boxes of documents. Most were disorganized, incomplete. Muster rolls listed names without faces. Morning reports tracked daily operations without personal detail. Transfer and deployment record showed movements, not lives. Still, Dr. Patterson cross-referenced everything. The 347th Quartermaster Company had been activated in early 1943, trained at Camp Lee, and shipped to England in July. It consisted of roughly 150 men, nearly all African-American, commanded by white officers. A standard arrangement in the segregated military. He had names, but no faces. So he widened his search. He combed through local newspapers, base newsletters, command reports, and personal letters archived across the country. Then, at the Library of Congress, he found a small collection of letters written by soldiers stationed at Camp Lee in 1943. Most were from white soldiers' notes about training, homesickness, care packages. But buried among them was one letter from a black soldier named Isaiah, addressed to his sister in North Carolina. It was dated May 1943, just weeks after the photograph had been taken. Isaiah wrote about brutal labor details, constant discrimination, and exhaustion. But one paragraph made Dr. Patterson's hands tremble as he read, "We had our company photograph taken last month. I made sure to stand where I could be seen, and I made the sign like Daddy taught us. Maybe someday somebody will see it and understand what we went through here. Maybe someday it will matter." Isaiah had left his mark on purpose. Dr. Patterson immediately requested every document connected to the letter's donor. The records showed the collection had been donated in 1987 by a woman named Dorothy, with a forwarding address in Durham, North Carolina. After 2 weeks of searching, Dr. Patterson located Dorothy's daughter, Patricia, who still lived there. When he called and explained what he had found, she was silent for a long moment. "My uncle Isaiah served in World War II, she finally said, her voice shaking. "He died in 1989. My mother kept all his letters, everything he sent home. She always said there was something important in them, something that had to be remembered. Do you have any photographs of your uncle from the war?" Dr. Patterson asked. "I have one," Patricia said. "Just one. He's in uniform, standing in front of barracks. Taken at a camp in Virginia." Dr. Patterson's heart raced. "Would you be willing to share it with me? I believe your uncle may be in a photograph. I'm researching one where he left a very important message." 3 days later, an envelope arrived at Dr. Patterson's office. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a young man in an army uniform, standing in front of wooden barracks, a faint smile on his face. On the back, written in careful script, Isaiah, Camp Lee, 1943. Dr. Patterson placed the photo beside the enlarged section of the group portrait, the soldier forming the equality sign. The face matched. The uniform matched. The timeline aligned perfectly. After 76 years, the man had a name, Isaiah. His message had finally reached someone who understood. With Isaiah identified, Dr. Patterson began reconstructing his life from letters, archives, and family memories. Isaiah had been born in 1921 in a small town outside Durham, North Carolina, the youngest of 4 children. His father worked as a carpenter. His mother cleaned houses for white families. They attended church every Sunday, tended a small garden, and saved whatever they could. Isaiah was a gifted student. He graduated from his local black high school with honors in 1939. He dreamed of college, of becoming a teacher, but money made that impossible. Instead, he worked beside his father for 2 years, learning carpentry and saving what he could. Then, Pearl Harbor changed everything. In December 1941, Isaiah registered for the draft. He was inducted in February 1942 and sent to Camp Lee for training. Like most black soldiers, he was assigned not to combat, but to a service unit, the 347th Quartermaster Company. There, he spent the war loading trucks, organizing supplies, and performing the exhausting, invisible labor that kept the Army alive. Through Patricia's collection of letters, Dr. Patterson came to know Isaiah not only as a soldier, but as a thoughtful, observant young man wrestling with the contradiction of risking his life for a country that still denied him basic dignity. In a letter dated March 1943, Isaiah wrote, "We work twice as hard as the white companies and get half the respect. The officers treat us like we're stupid, like we can't be trusted with anything important. But we do our jobs, and we do them well because that's who we are. We have dignity, even when they try to take it from us." Another letter, written in April 1943, the same month, the photograph was taken, revealed Isaiah's full awareness of what that moment meant. "They took our company picture today. All of us, lined up nice and neat, like we're really part of this army as equals. But I made sure anyone looking close enough will see the truth. I made the sign Daddy taught me, the one that says what we can't say out loud. Someday, somebody's going to look at that picture and understand." Dr. Patterson soon uncovered another powerful truth. Isaiah's father had been quietly involved in early civil rights work in North Carolina, registering black voters, advocating for better schools, and pushing for fair treatment whenever and wherever he could. He had taught his children about dignity, resistance, and the importance of leaving proof, of documenting truth even when it could not be spoken safely. The equality sign Isaiah made in that photograph was not just a personal act. It was part of a family tradition of quiet resistance, a method of asserting humanity in systems designed to deny it. Isaiah shipped to England with his company in July 1943. After D-Day in 1944, he crossed into France, where his unit supported combat operations, hauling ammunition and supplies through dangerous territory, often under fire. Yet they were never officially recognized as combat soldiers. Isaiah survived the war and returned to North Carolina in 1946. According to Patricia, he came home changed. He rarely spoke about his service, but he became quietly active in the growing civil rights movement, attending meetings, supporting voter registration drives, and advocating for equality in his community. He worked as a carpenter like his father, married in 1950, raised 3 children, and lived a long, steady life. He died in 1989 at the age of 68. He used to tell us that being seen was important. Patricia told Dr. Patterson, he'd say, "They try to make us invisible, but we're here, we exist, and someday people will know we were here and what we gave." I never really understood what he meant until now. When Dr. Patterson asked if anyone else in the family might remember Isaiah's stories, Patricia mentioned Isaiah's eldest daughter, Claudia, who lived in Atlanta and had spent significant time with her father before his death, recording some of his memories. Within days, Dr. Patterson flew to Atlanta, carrying the photograph and copies of Isaiah's letters. When Claudia opened the door and saw the image, she froze. "That's my father," she said, her voice trembling. "I've never seen this picture before, but that's him." She invited Dr. Patterson inside. For the next 4 hours, they sat at her dining room table, surrounded by photographs, letters, and old recordings, as she shared everything she knew about her father's life. Claudia, now 62, was a retired social worker who had devoted her career to serving marginalized communities. She explained that her father rarely spoke about the war during her childhood, but in his final years, sensing time was running short, he began to open up. She had recorded several of those conversations. He told me about leaving evidence, she said, pulling out a small digital recorder. Not the photograph exactly, but the idea behind it. He said when speaking up could get you punished or killed, you had to find other ways to testify. She pressed play. Isaiah's aged but steady voice filled the room. When they treat you like you're invisible, like you don't exist, you have to remind yourself in the world that you do. Every chance I got, in whatever small way I could, I made sure there was proof that I was there, that I saw what was happening, that I deserved better. That photograph they took of our company, I made the sign my father taught me. I figured maybe someday somebody would see it and understand what we went through. Dr. Patterson listened with tears in his eyes. This was no longer interpretation or historical guesswork. This was Isaiah himself explaining exactly what he had done and why. More recordings followed. Isaiah spoke of daily humiliation in the segregated military, being barred from facilities that even German prisoners of war could use, being called slurs by the very officers who commanded him, being assigned the most dangerous, degrading work while being told he wasn't brave enough for combat. He described the exhaustion of having to prove his worth over and over only to be dismissed regardless of performance. But he also spoke of resistance, of solidarity, of how black soldiers supported one another, shared information, and found small but powerful ways to assert their dignity. He spoke about the equality sign, specifically, explaining that several men in his unit knew it and used it when they could in photographs taken during moments of surveillance and documentation. We weren't just victims, Isaiah's recorded voice said firmly. We were witnesses, we saw the injustice, we lived it, and we documented it however we could. We knew history likes to erase uncomfortable truths, so we made sure to leave evidence that couldn't be erased. Claudia also described her father's post-war activism. After returning home, Isaiah worked with the NAACP, participated in early civil rights organizing, and mentored young people in his community. He passed down the same lessons his father had taught him about dignity, resistance, and the importance of being seen. He used to say the equality sign wasn't just a gesture, Claudia said, it was a philosophy. It meant refusing to accept being treated as less. It meant insisting on your humanity, and it meant leaving proof for the future that you existed and that you mattered. Dr. Patterson asked if he could make copies of the recordings, and if Claudia would allow Isaiah's story to be shared publicly. She didn't hesitate. My father would want this known, she said. He spent his whole life making sure black experiences weren't erased from history. This photograph, this story, it's exactly what he fought for. People need to know what men like him endured, and they need to know that even in the worst conditions, we found ways to resist. Before Dr. Patterson left Atlanta, Claudia handed him one more item, a small worn notebook that Isaiah had carried with him. During the war, most of the notebook was filled with ordinary entries, supply counts, duty schedules, small personal reminders. But on one page dated April 1943, Dr. Patterson found a single line that stopped him cold. Comp today. Made the sign for Daddy, for my children, for whoever sees this someday and understands. Dr. Patterson held the notebook with careful hands, fully aware that he was touching direct proof of a quiet act of resistance, an act that had waited 76 years to be discovered, understood, and honored. With Isaiah finally identified and his story preserved, Dr. Patterson turned to the other 14 men in the photograph. Who were they? What had they experienced? And most of all, had any of them known what Isaiah was doing when he formed that silent gesture? He returned to the military records with renewed intensity, working to identify every soldier in the formation. It was painstaking work matching faces with unit rosters, cross-referencing service numbers, deployment dates, and the few surviving photographs scattered across archives. Slowly, name by name, identity by identity, figures in the photograph came into focus. Most of the white soldiers had come from Virginia, Maryland, and other mid-Atlantic states. They trained at Camp Lee, deployed to England, and later supported the D-Day invasion and the long campaign across Europe. Some were killed in action. Others died of disease. Many returned home, built families, pursued careers, and lived quietly ordinary post-war lives. Dr. Patterson traced their paths through obituaries, newspaper clippings, and memorial records. One soldier, Robert, later became a teacher. Another, William, worked in manufacturing. A third, James, was killed in France in 1944 when his supply convoy came under attack. Every name carried a life. Every life carried a story. But Dr. Patterson was driven by one question above all others. Had any of them truly seen Isaiah? Had they noticed the gesture? Had they understood it? Or had Isaiah's silent testimony gone completely unseen by the men standing only feet away from him? He found a partial answer in an unexpected voice from the future. After a preliminary article about the research was published, Dr. Patterson was contacted by Richard, the son of one of the white soldiers who had stood in the front row of the photograph. Richard, now in his 70s, explained that his father Thomas had occasionally spoken about the image before his death in 1995. "My father kept a copy of that photograph his whole life," Richard said during a phone call. "It sat in a frame on his desk. I asked him about it once, and he said something strange. He said, 'That picture reminds me that I didn't see what I should have seen.' I never understood what he meant." Dr. Patterson asked if Richard might share any of his father's wartime letters or papers. Richard agreed and mailed several boxes of documents. Among them was a letter written by Thomas to his wife in 1968, 25 years after the photograph was taken, during the height of the civil rights movement. In the letter, Thomas reflected on his military service. "I've been thinking a lot about the war lately, watching what's happening in this country now. We had black soldiers in support roles, men who worked harder than most of us ever did, and we barely acknowledged their existence. They were doing essential work, and we treated them like they were invisible. I look at that old company photo sometimes, and I see that young black soldier standing at the edge. I wonder what he thought of us, of the army, of serving a country that treated him that way. I wish I had seen him then the way I see him now, as a fellow soldier who deserved respect and equality. I was blind to so much back then." The letter moved Dr. Patterson deeply. It showed that at least one man had eventually recognized the injustice, even if it had taken decades. But it also confirmed something painful. At the moment the photograph was taken, Isaiah had been functionally invisible to most of the men beside him, present in the frame, yet unseen as a full human being. Dr. Patterson continued tracking down the other families when possible. Many were shocked to learn their fathers or grandfathers had served alongside a black soldier at Camp Lee. Some were surprised to learn that black soldiers had even been stationed there at all. The gaps in historical memory had erased Isaiah not only in life but in remembrance. Yet among younger generations the response was different. Many were deeply moved. They began asking questions about segregation in the military, about black soldiers' experiences, about how injustice had been built into everyday life during the war. The photograph was no longer just an artifact. It had become a catalyst. After 8 months of work, Dr. Patterson compiled his findings into a comprehensive report. It documented Isaiah's identity and life story, analyzed the equality gesture, placed the photograph within the broader history of segregation in the U.S. military, and traced the experiences of the other soldiers in the formation. The final report stretched over 150 pages, a fusion of rigorous scholarship and deeply human storytelling. He first presented it at an academic World War II history conference in Washington, D.C. The room was packed with historians, military scholars, and journalists. Dr. Patterson projected the photograph onto a large screen and guided the audience through every stage of the investigation. The discovery, the gesture, the search for Isaiah, the letters, the recordings, the broader context. When he finished, the room sat in complete silence. Then the applause erupted. Several historians said they had never seen such clear evidence of deliberate, documented resistance within the segregated military. Others said they would return to their own archives to re-examine photographs they had once studied only at the surface. But the story did not stay within academic walls. A journalist from the Washington Post attended the presentation and soon published a major feature titled "Soldier's Silent Message: How One Man's Gesture in a 1943 Photo Speaks Across Generations." And from that moment on, Isaiah's quiet act of defiance finally began to echo far beyond the frame that once held him. The article featured the photograph prominently, alongside excerpts from Isaiah's letters and audio recordings, as well as interviews with Claudia and Dr. Patterson. Within hours, the story went viral. Major news organizations picked it up: CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the BBC. Social media flooded with shares, reactions, and commentary. The photograph appeared everywhere, often with close-up highlights framing Isaiah's hands in the equality gesture. The response from the African-American community was especially profound. People began sharing their own family stories of quiet resistance and survival during the Jim Crow era. Elders said they recognized the sign that they, too, had been taught similar gestures by grandparents and great-grandparents. Younger generations expressed, or that such an underground system of silent communication had existed at all, and gratitude that these long-hidden stories were finally being seen. Civil rights organizations reached out to Dr. Patterson, asking to use the image educational programs and public exhibitions. Then came a call from the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. They wanted to acquire the original photograph and create a permanent display centered on Isaiah and the broader tradition of cultural resistance within the segregated military. Schools adopted the story almost immediately. Teachers used it to explore World War II, segregation, resistance, and the importance of questioning official narratives. Students wrote essays, created art projects, and began researching their own local histories of discrimination and defiance. Dr. Patterson also received messages from active duty service members, especially black soldiers, who said the story resonated deeply with their own experiences of navigating predominantly white institutions while trying to assert identity and demand respect. But some of the most moving responses came from ordinary people, descendants of black veterans, family historians, and community members who said Isaiah's story validated experiences that had been whispered for generations but never officially recognized. One woman wrote, "My grandfather served in World War II and came home angry and silent. He died when I was young, and I never understood why the war had left him so bitter. Seeing this photograph and learning Isaiah's story helped me understand what my grandfather may have carried inside all those years. Thank you for finally making that pain visible." A photograph that had gathered dust in an archive for decades, noticed by no one, had become one of the most significant historical images of World War II, not because it showed dramatic combat or famous leaders, but because it captured one man's quiet, unbreakable refusal to be invisible. 6 months after the story broke nationwide, the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened a special exhibition, Silent Testimony, Resistance and Dignity in the Segregated Military. At its center stood Isaiah's photograph, enlarged to a monumental scale. Detailed annotations explained the context, the gesture, and the silent message behind his hands. But the exhibition went far beyond a single image. With the help of historians and community members across the country, Dr. Patterson and his team uncovered 12 additional World War II photographs showing black soldiers making similar gestures, symbols of equality, dignity, and coded resistance that had gone unnoticed for generations. Together, they revealed a widespread, hidden practice of visual protest and documentation. Each image was paired with letters when available, unit histories, explanation of the gestures, and whenever possible, updates on the soldiers' post-war lives. Taken together, the photographs exposed a quiet network of resistance. Black soldiers across different units, different battlegrounds, and different years of the war, all finding ways to leave evidence of their humanity inside a system determined to deny it. Another section of the exhibition explored the broader history of coded communication in black communities during Jim Crow. Historians and cultural scholars contributed essays, artifacts, and demonstrations showing how African Americans developed sophisticated nonverbal systems to navigate danger, share information, and preserve dignity under constant threat. Interactive displays allowed visitors to learn the gestures and understand their meanings and origins. Video interviews with elders provided first-hand testimony. Recordings like Isaiah's, shared by Claudia, played continuously, allowing visitors to hear directly from the voices the photographs had frozen in time. The opening ceremony drew more than 1,000 people. Claudia attended with Patricia and other descendants of soldiers featured in the exhibit. Veterans organizations sent representatives. Active duty service members arrived in uniform. Civil rights leaders spoke about the ongoing relevance of the stories now being told. When Claudia stood before the massive image of her father, his youthful face, deliberate gesture finally honored, fully understood, she broke down in tears. He would be so proud, she whispered to Dr. Patterson, who stood beside her. He spent his whole life making sure black contributions weren't erased. Now his own story is being told in the National Museum. He's finally being seen. The exhibition was originally scheduled to run for 6 months. The crowds never slowed. It was extended indefinitely, then made part of the museum's permanent collection. School groups arrived by the hundreds. Veterans came to pay respects and share their own stories. Families brought children and grandchildren to teach them about this hidden chapter of history. Media coverage continued for months. Documentary filmmakers began work on feature-length films about Isaiah and the other soldiers. Academic publishers released new books exploring visual resistance within oppressive systems. Universities incorporated the exhibition into their curricula, But perhaps the most profound impact was quieter and deeper. The exhibition changed how people looked at old photographs, no longer as frozen, distant moments, but as living documents, as fields of hidden testimony, as places where truth might still be waiting if someone is finally willing to look close enough. Museums, archives, and historical societies across the country began to re-examine their collections with new eyes, searching for similar gestures, hidden messages, and quiet acts of resistance they had once overlooked. Dozens of new discoveries followed. Photographs emerged that revealed silent testimony images that had been invisible to researchers simply because no one had known what to look for. The exhibition sparked a fundamental shift in historical methodology, a recognition that marginalized people often left evidence of their lives in subtle, coded ways, signals that demanded cultural knowledge, patience, and careful attention to be understood. It elevated the importance of community wisdom and oral history in interpreting visual records, and it exposed how official narratives had frequently erased or ignored critical truths that could only be recovered by listening to those who had lived them. Isaiah's gesture in that 1943 photograph had accomplished exactly what he had hoped it would. It testified, it documented, and at last it was seen and understood. 3 years after Dr. Patterson's initial discovery, Isaiah's photograph and story had reshaped entire fields of study and transformed public understanding of World War II. The impact rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted, touching education, military policy, cultural preservation, and collective memory. Universities launched new research initiatives focused on recovering hidden narratives from visual evidence. Graduate students wrote dissertations analyzing overlooked details, hand positions, posture, spatial arrangements, small elements that might encode resistance or testimony. Academic conferences devoted full panels to new methods for detecting and interpreting silent communication in historical photographs. Even the military took notice. The Department of Defense commissioned a comprehensive review of the treatment of African American service members throughout U.S. military history, with special focus on World War II. The report formally acknowledged systemic discrimination, validated the experiences of soldiers like Isaiah, and committed to including these stories in official military histories and service academies. Several military bases established memorials honoring black soldiers who had served in segregated units. At Camp Lee, where Isaiah's photograph had been taken, a permanent installation now featured his image alongside historical context and information about the 347th Quartermaster Company. Veterans and their families could stand there and pay tribute to those who had defended a nation that had not yet fully defended them. Educational materials spread rapidly. Textbooks were revised to include segregation in the military and the resistance strategies used by black soldiers. Documentary films aired on major networks and streaming platforms. Museums nationwide requested reproductions of Isaiah's photograph for their own exhibition. The gesture itself, the equality sign Isaiah had formed with his hands, became a living symbol. It appeared in protest movements, in artwork, and in classrooms advocating for racial justice. Some predominantly black military units even adopted it into informal traditions, honoring soldiers like Isaiah, who had demanded dignity without ever being allowed to speak it aloud. Claudia became a sought-after speaker at schools, universities, and community centers. She always emphasized that her father's act was not singular, that countless black Americans had resisted in creative, quiet ways, and that many of those stories were still waiting to be discovered. My father's photograph was noticed, she would tell audiences, because one historian took the time to look closely and ask questions. But there are thousands more photographs, letters, and artifacts sitting in attics and archives with their stories still locked inside. We have to keep looking, keep asking, keep listening, especially to the communities whose voices were pushed out of official history. Dr. Patterson published a book titled Silent Testimony: Visual Resistance in the Segregated Military, 1941 to 1945, which became required reading in college history courses across the country. He used the advances and royalties to create a scholarship fund for students studying African American military history, ensuring future generations would continue the work of uncovering these hidden truths. The photograph also transformed how families saw their own pasts. People began re-examining photo albums, searching for ancestors who might have left similar messages. Community archives rushed to digitize fragile collections before they were lost. Genealogists worked with historians to connect visual evidence to family stories and oral histories. But the most profound legacy was personal. Young black students saw Isaiah's image and recognized themselves. They learned that resistance and dignity had deep roots, that their ancestors had fought for recognition in every generation, and that courage could take many forms, including a silent gesture that speaks across decades. Veterans from more recent conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, reached out to share how Isaiah's story echoed their own experiences of service amid discrimination and doubt. The photograph became a touchstone for conversations about how far the military had come and how far it still had to go. Isaiah's descendants, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, found themselves connected to a vast community that honored his legacy. Claudia's grandchildren grew up knowing their great-grandfather's name, his purpose, his quiet bravery. They understood that he had been part of something larger than his own lifetime, and that his resistance mattered. The photograph now hung in countless classrooms, offices, museums, and homes, no longer forgotten, no longer silent, still speaking. Our people no longer looked at the photograph and saw only 15 soldiers standing in formation. They saw a testament to the power of bearing witness, the necessity of leaving evidence behind, and the courage it takes to claim your humanity when entire systems are built to deny it. 5 years after the photograph's discovery, Dr. Patterson returned to the Virginia Historical Society, the very place where his investigation had begun. He was scheduled to give a lecture that evening, but he arrived early and asked to visit the archives once again, to see where the image had rested in silence for so many decades. The archivist led him into the climate-controlled room and to the exact box that had once held the forgotten photograph. Dr. Patterson stood there quietly for a long moment, thinking about the countless researchers who had likely studied that image before him and seen nothing extraordinary, just another standard military portrait from World War. "How many more photographs like this are in these archives?" he asked softly, "with messages we still haven't learned how to read?" The archivist smiled. "Since your discovery," she said, "dozens of researchers have been re-examining our collection, specifically looking for similar gestures and hidden communications. We've already found 3 more, different wars, different situations, but the same principal people leaving evidence, trusting that one day someone would understand." That evening, the lecture hall was filled to capacity. Dr. Patterson displayed Isaiah's photograph on the screen and told the full story once again: the discovery, the investigation, the identification, the meaning, and the impact. But this time, he ended with something new. He revealed a photograph discovered just weeks earlier in a private collection in South Carolina. It showed a group of black women who had served as nurses during World War II, photographed at a military hospital in 1944, and there, subtly concealed by the way several of the women rested their hands in their laps, was a variation of the same equality gesture, so delicate it would remain invisible to anyone not specifically trained to look for it, yet unmistakable once seen. Isaiah's photograph was not an isolated act, Dr. Patterson told the hushed audience. It was part of a much broader practice of silent testimony, of coded evidence, of quiet resistance, of refusing to let history erase both the truth of discrimination and the dignity of endurance. We are only beginning to grasp how widespread this practice truly was, and how many messages are still waiting to be decoded. He advanced the slide again. A dozen recently discovered photographs appeared on the screen, each containing similar gestures or hidden signs. These images have been sitting in archives, attics, and family albums for decades, he said. Some were even digitized and posted online where millions could see them. But no one noticed what was there because we were not looking with the right eyes. We were not asking the right questions. We were not bringing the necessary cultural knowledge to the interpretation. He paused, allowing the silence to settle. History is not only what appears in official documents and textbooks. History is also what hides in plain sight, waiting for someone with the curiosity, the knowledge, and the commitment to truly see it. Isaiah and others like him trusted that their messages would one day reach us. They believed future generations would care enough to look, to ask, and to understand. Dr. Patterson closed by displaying Isaiah's photograph one final time, the young soldier at the edge of the formation, his hands forming a simple gesture that had traveled across 76 years before finally being understood. "Every time we recover one of these hidden messages," he said, "every time we identify a soldier like Isaiah and tell his story, we honor not only that individual, but the deeper principle they stood for. Truth matters, documentation matters, bearing witness matters, especially when systems of power prefer certain truths to remain unseen." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Afterward, people approached Dr. Patterson holding photographs from their own family collections, asking if he would examine them for similar signs. He agreed to every request, knowing that any one of those images might contain another story waiting to be told, another voice waiting to be heard. Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Dr. Patterson looked once more at the photograph that had started everything. He thought about Isaiah, the young man who had served a nation that did not fully serve him in return, a man who had found a way to leave proof of his life, his dignity, and his demand for equality, a man who had trusted that one day someone would understand. Isaiah had been right to trust. His message had been received. His story had been told. His gesture had crossed generations and reshaped how thousands now understood history, resistance, and the power of witness. More than that, his quiet act had ignited something lasting, a shared commitment among historians, archivists, educators, and everyday people to keep looking, to keep questioning, and to keep listening to the voices that official history had tried to silence. The photograph would outlive everyone connected to it. Long after Dr. Patterson, Claudia, and all the descendants were gone, the image would remain a young soldier in 1943 forming a simple gesture with his hands, declaring his equality, documenting his truth, and speaking to a future he would never see but still believed in. And that belief, that faith in future generations to finally see, understand, and honor the truth may have been the most powerful message of all. Isaiah's hands would continue to speak. His testimony would continue to resonate. His quiet courage would continue to inspire, because at last he had been seen. And at last he had been heard.